organizing the logistics of the talks, as well as designing these beautifully put up backgrounds and posters. I want to emphasize again our appreciation to them. Now, let me try to introduce our speaker today. With great pleasure and honor, I'd like to introduce Dr. Pradip Thomas from University of Queensland. Dr. Thomas is an associate professor working at the University of Queensland on communication studies. Right? So if you have some knowledge about Dr. Pradip's works, you will be surprised and thrilled by the prolific productivity Dr. Pradip shows, right? Other than numerous journal articles and book chapters, Dr. Pradip has already authored 10 books, right? And if you look at the topics of these 10 books, some of them are about digital India, but there are also a good number of books that focus on a larger field and topic, which is communication for social change. So the book Dr. Pradip is going to introduce today focused on digital India and the politics of digital India. Right? So the plan of this event goes like this. We're going to first invite Dr. Pradip to probably revisit his recent book and again shares with us the most important insights and views he has expressed in this book, right? After that, we're going to invite our own Dr. Taberez Neyazi to provide comments. The comments will last for about 10 to 15 minutes. And after Dr. Pradip responds to the comments, we're going to open the floor to all the participants for Q&A. And the whole event is planned to last for about 1.5 hours. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Pradip to start his sharing.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by...
Pradip.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to thank you, Wayu, Jack, Taberez, Shen, and others at NUS for organizing this event. I'm really chuffed that you've chosen this particular book for a larger discussion. So I'm really happy that you guys have done that. Let me give you some background to how I ended writing this book before I deal with the kind of nitty-gritty of this book. So, I think Jack probably knows that I am, at least I think I'm a critical political economist of communications. A tradition that I was exposed to when I was doing my master's and PhD at the now defunct Center for Mass Communication Research at the University of Leicester. So I consider, professors like Peter Golding and Graham Murdoch as my mentors, along with folks like Dan Schiller and Cis Hamlink. These are the folks who've kind of contributed to, and shaping me, making me what I am today. So I guess using a phrase that I borrowed from Graham, and in the tradition of my mentors, I've always been involved in exploring the gaps between ideological promise and institutional performance, right? That's what I've done in terms of my work. Over the last 20 years or 25 years, this is what my work has been, basically looking at those gaps between ideological promise and institutional performance. And this book, like most, if not all of my writings, deals with an interrogation of some of these gaps, but also with some of the challenges facing the fashioning of India into a digital nation, right? So that's what I've been looking at, some of those gaps and some of those challenges. I've also been very interested in what ought to be, what ought to be, what should the digital look like in India, right? Although it's tough to deal with that question within this particular conjuncture in India, and closures that are a cause of, that is because of this pervasive hyper-nationalism that you have in the country. So V.S. Naipaul some of you may have read V.S. Naipaul. He's from Trinidad. He was an Indian origin author. He once described India as a land of 1,000,000 mutinies, right? And that really, I think, is one of India's strengths. For example, today, if you look at India today, you have a farmers' agitation or many other movements that hold truth to power, right? Processes that I continue to be fascinated with, right? So it's about gaps, it's about challenges, but it's also about hope and opportunities, right? I think another issue that I've been concerned with is this holding of truth to power, right? And I think, given my background in political economy and social change, I've been, very interested in understanding context in India. What's the kind of digital context and the factors that animate context, especially things like caste and politics, right? It's pretty, you can come across writings that don't deal with these larger issues. But I really think that if you're a political economist of communications, you sometimes decenter the media to understand it better, right? You decenter the media, deal with other issues that impact on the media. And that's what I do for a living, right? I'm also conscious of the need to think through these issues with an Indian lens, right? And that's always a tough one. Because in India, I don't think we have vernacularly defined grand narratives of progress. We don't have them. And I'm wary of using concepts borrowed from kind of the dominant tradition of making sense of India, which is a very Brahminic tradition, right? I'm wary of those kinds of borrowings. Right? So enough of this background. I've been following the many trajectories of the digital India since its inception, right? From the early ambitions of the state in computing and satellite technologies, the always present desire to indigenize these technologies with folks like Sam Petroda and the Center for the Development of Telematics, the consequences of the liberalization of telecoms in the early 1990s, the privatization of these industries, the arrival and proliferation of mobile phones, the political economy of major players such as geo-reliance, their ascendance to the throne, as it were, and of course the role played by civil society in engaging with alternatives, such as free and open source software, public sector software in the context of my own home state, Kerala, where they've experimented with these kinds of traditions of alternatives. Right? All these I've been interested in, right? And of course, the background, of course, is the ambitions of the nation to become a knowledge superpower, right? So when you talk of the politics of digital India, it really is about India trying to, push forward its ambitions as a digital superpower, right? And the challenges that it's faced in the context of pushing forward those ambitions. So it's a supersized ambition of the national state, right? And what's happened over the last, say, 10 years or 20 years is, all this has become subservient to the project of governmentality. And that would seem to be one of the key kinds of motives of digital India today, right? Now, each of these developments that I've looked at can be seen in the context of very specific political economies that lend themselves to a certain conjunctural analysis. None of these stories can be described in black and white, as each has been shaped by multiple forces, right? And that again is one of the kind of, one of the issues that I deal with in this particular book. Even the Indian state, right? Indian state has played an absolutely critical role in the shaping of the digital, but the Indian state itself has changed its spots, as it were, right? The Indian state today is very unlike the Indian state 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? And I think, when dealing with the digital in countries like India, you've got to deal with that kind of a conjunctural kind of analysis. The state in India has always been a complex entity and a source for many tendencies. Of course, today, one might argue that the tendencies are pretty negative in some ways, right? But if you look at the history of the Indian state, you'll also find instances where they have done some really positive things. Like, for example, the right to information movement, the right to information legislation, right? These kinds of things were very, very positive. So it's been a complex entity, which has been the source for all sorts of tendencies, ranging from the potentially liberatory to the populist fascist. And I think we are going through that populist fascist, period at this particular moment in time. So it's unsurprising that these positions are imprinted on the story of the digital in India, right? So these positions are there, you can see it. And in this particular book, I borrowed the descriptor of the Indian state used by the political scientists Susan and Lloyd Rudolph in their book, The Pursuit of Lakshmi, in which they call the term the Indian state, in quotes, polymorphous, a creature of many manifold forms and orientations, right? And it's that state and its relationship with the digital that I've kind of dealt with in this particular book. So any account of the digital India, and of course there are many accounts of the digital India, there are lots of accounts who look at digital India as, a country exercising its sovereignty, right? Creating its own digital infrastructures, digital policies on its own steam and without any interference from the outside, right? But I really believe that, if you want to account for the digital India, I think you cannot understand it in situ as something that is, just within India. It is, shaped by external forces as well, right? And so the book deals with those shapings by both internal forces and external forces, right? So some of you may know that, I've been for a long time involved in writing about media imperialism. I still believe in those old concepts, despite the fact that things have changed, right? People might think I'm old-fashioned, but I'm afraid that countries like the USA has been a hegemonic power, right? It continues to be a hegemonic power, and it continues to kind of exert its influence in countries like India, right? The relationship between India and the USA has been fascinatingly one-sided over the years, be it in the transfers of technology, in supercomputing, in satellites, to the opening and closing and opportunities for Indian software labor. For example, visas for Indian software specialists to go to the USA, that's been closed for some time. And of course, the sanctions and threat of sanctions via Section 301 rulings taken by the US Trade Representative. Most recently, in the context of India's levying of a Google tax. So some of you are probably aware that India is one of a few countries that actually levy a Google tax, right? It's called the equalization levy. But this has been, India's moves has been taken to task by the USA because they strongly believe that this is against trade policy, that this is against WTO policy, that this affects their industries, their companies in a negative kind of way, et cetera, et cetera. So in my writings, the visible and invisible hand of the USA in shaping India's digital futures, for better or for worse, does feature, right? Sometimes to the chagrin of some reviewers of my writings, who tend to take the view that India as a knowledge superpower is resolutely independent in its decision making when it comes to the digital. Far from it, as the evidence suggests, right? And my book is about that evidence as well. Okay. So in 2012, I completed a trilogy of writings on the media in India, all published by Sage, beginning with a book on the political economy of communications in India, followed by another one on communication rights movements, followed by Digital India. So this book, The Politics of Digital India, is a natural follow-up to that last book. And I think one of the issues with the word digital is that it represents a kind of materiality that is now the basis for every productive sector in the economy, right? So the question of what to deal with when doing research on the digital is a tough one. What do you focus on? Because everything is digital, right? Everything has become digitized, right? Every productive sector has been digitized. So I think I've been rather idiosyncratic in what I've dealt with in this book. And I would be the first to admit that there are significant absences. I don't, for example, deal explicitly with social media. And that is because there are many researchers, wonderful researchers like Taberez, for example, or Sahana Udupa, and many folks who are actually working on various aspects of social media. So I do not need to deal with that. Nor do I deal with the political economy of the mobile phone, although I've dealt with the growth of monopolies in the sector, in particular Reliance Jio in other writings. So this book is a part of a series of books, and the series is called the Media Dynamics in South Asia, that my colleagues Adrian, Vibod, and Srinivas are involved in editing. And some of you, of course, know these guys. Now, the book itself is dedicated to three close friends of mine, And I think some of them are here, Zaram Nain, Philip Lee, and Ramesh Ramanathan. And these are guys that I've spent a lot of time with, both in terms of discussing ideas, but also having a glass of whiskey kind of stuff, right? Over the years. So they've been very close friends, and they continue to be very close friends of mine. And they've been fellow travelers. They've contributed to my conversations with both politics and the digital. So the book has got 8 chapters, beginning with an introduction, followed by a section titled The Control State with 3 chapters, followed by another section called, basically entitled The Sovereign Ambivalent State, also with 3 chapters, and then a concluding chapters. Right? So let me try and deal with some of the core aspects of this book. So there are 8 chapters, 2 sections, one on the control state, one on the kind of ambivalent state, right? Where you can't really put you can't really fix the state because the state is involved in doing interesting things, right? So firstly, I think the book deals with the emerging digital in India as an outcome of both local politics and external geopolitics, right? I find the local politics associated with the right-wing Sangh Parivar, which is the family of Hindu organizations, that back up the BJP, interesting, not least because one of the key organizations, the RSS, and its economic wing, the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, have played a role in limiting full-blown economic liberalization that the BJP and its allies were committed to. In other words, within the family of Hindu organizations, you have a lot of contestation, right? You have a group, you have an economic wing that actually supports labor in some ways. In some ways, they can be, very regressive in some of their policies, but they can also be so-called progressive, in some of the other policies. So, the reason being that there is a kind of overlap in the constituencies wooed by both the left and the right in India, right? That's one of the reasons for it. So, for example, if you look at the recent elections in West Bengal, where the BJP became second best, if you look at the constituency that the BJP had, these are all formerly left people. Most of them used to be associated with the left at one time or the other, but they've kind of moved to the BJP kind of. Right? But for me, it's interesting that that organizations like the Swadeshi Jagran Manch have been in the forefront of resisting major, say, global e-commerce platforms, and also, for example, GM foods in India. They've been at the forefront of resisting them. And these were issues that typically at one time were associated with the left, right? So that's an interesting conundrum, right? Where something that used to be part of the left's agenda has now become part of the right's agenda, which I find interesting. At the same time, of course, these organizations have kind of have supported the digitization of the state and its welfare economy. Like I said earlier, this book also deals extensively with India's geopolitics, primarily its relationship with the USA, right? And of course, the USA is a country that historically has been the key source for transfers of computing digital technologies. One of the main destinations for Indian IT labor, a key partner in India's investment in surveillance. And there's a chapter on that relationship with the USA in terms of surveillance. And one, of course, the main destinations for Indian IT labor. And of course, also in defense, a key partner. Right? And when you look at surveillance and defense, you need to look at it in the context of China's ambitions in South Asia, right? India as being a kind of countervailing force, right? Okay? But in the way I've seen it, the US has also traditionally been a difficult partner to deal with in the areas of transfers of technology. And India has had lots of issues with the US in the past. When it came to supercomputing, transfers of technology and satellites, they had the major issues with the export of what are called dual use technologies. And there was also always a fear that the Indian government would actually pass on trade secrets to the USSR. So this is part of the kind of Cold War kind of thinking in the old days. Right? But I think the USA still continues to have, harbor those kinds of issues. Moreover, as I've written in my book, they've used Section 301 sanctions to restrict the manufacturing of generic drugs, limit software patents, and of course have taken a very protectionist stance against Indian IT labor. Secondly, it is the second characteristic is about the state itself in India, right? The state, people are tempted to kind of treat the state in India as in black and white terms, although it's a lot more complicated. So the first section, consisting of 3 chapters, deals with the control state, right? And we know, a lot about that control state, given the fact that, you've had major governmentality projects like the Aadhaar project, we've had internet lockdowns in the Kashmir Valley, surveillance, algorithmic surveillance, all these kinds of things that we are only too familiar with, right? We are, there are issues with Twitter, all that kind of stuff that we're very familiar with. Surveillance is big business in India, and I deal with that part of big business. And code and algorithmic power is being used to control both ordinary citizens and what the state considers it to be recalcitrant populations. However, such investments in surveillance and control are not the entire story of the digital India. So in the second section, consisting of 3 chapters, I deal with the state's support for what can be considered to be broadly progressive policies. That includes, for example, India's key role in the WIPO Treaty for the Visually Impaired, the Marrakesh Treaty, that 2013, that allows people with visual disabilities to not have to take permission from copyright holders to change text to formats of their own choice. Right? And this is a significant global initiative, right? And the Indian government played a key role in pushing for that. And before that happened in 2012, there was a copyright amendment bill in India that enable kind of people with disabilities to not pay compensation to rights holders for the use of copyrighted material, right? So to me, those kinds of instances kind of point to what I would consider the ambivalent state, right? A state that can be, if it wants to be progressive, in some of its kind of global responses to the digital, right? And then there's a chapter also on its own stance on global internet governance, right? It's always played a kind of, it's had major issues with the status quo when it, in terms of internet governance. It's had issues with multi-stakeholderism and that whole concept, right? And so there are, and it's kind of, people would say that it's wishy-washy, it's gone from one position to another. But the fact that it's always considering new responses to internet governance, I find very interesting, right? And then of course, a chapter that I felt like writing, was the one on seed and transgenic seed, right? This one I found really interesting because given the fact that the digital has now invaded every sector, every productive sector, it's also invaded seed, right? And seed is the basis for the livelihoods of millions of people in India, right? So while we talk of the IT sector as booming and all the rest of it, we are talking of a few million people there. More than half the population is in agriculture, right? And that remains the reality even today. So the whole issue of seed and transgenic seed is absolutely fundamentally interesting because transgenic seed can be copied because it has been digitized, right? And the issue here is the use of transgenic seed in different parts of India, and the government actually turning a blind eye to the use of this seed by farmers, which again, I find, it's a very interesting, what should I say, conundrum, that you have a state on the one hand that could be, really strong and breathing down your neck. On the other hand, it opens other sectors. It doesn't deal with other sectors like IP in a kind of way in which global industry, expects them to do, right? All these big business, business alliance, software business alliance, all of them want India to take a stronger stance on intellectual property, et cetera, but it's a kind of it's a game, it's a dance, an elaborate dance that they play with these large industries. So I've dealt with those kinds of issues, right? The copying of seed, and the fact that that the state is capable of exerting incredible control, but also extending opportunities for access and policies supportive of the public interest. I find that very interesting. Thirdly, is the theoretical framework that I've used, based on concepts borrowed from Karl Polanyi's 1944, The Great Transformation, and in particular, the double movement that he talks about, and David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession, right? That's been widely used to describe the kind of marginalization that is happening through extra economic means throughout the world, right? So for example, in India, this would be marginalization through the expropriation of land, right? Which is big time, right? And so if you've been following the news, just last week, a Catholic Jesuit activist by the name of Stan Swamy died in prison. This was basically murdered in prison, right? Because of the stand that he took, in supporting indigenous communities in central India, whose lives are being threatened because of big corporations and mining interests who are very interested in the land that these indigenous people occupy, right? So I've used both Polanyi and David Harvey to understand and describe the role of the state in intervening in and bringing to heel a rampant market, right? So in Polanyi's case, I've used the term to describe the ambivalent responses of a complex state that can range from the establishment of regressive policies to broadly progressive policies, such as, say, the right to information movement, and advocating for the access rights of the visually impaired, right? So it's that double movement there that I'm very interested in. I think, David Harvey remains a favorite of mine. And I think he, more than any other contemporary critical political economist, deals with the workings of capital, but also with the many ways in which extra political factors are used in the politics of dispossession, right? In the context of India, legal means such as land acquisition laws to Aadhaar and other governmentality projects that can be used to further impoverish already impoverished populations. And like I said earlier, the death of Stan Swamy is a reminder that, of the penalties one can pay in India if you go against the interests of the state and its favored corporations. So land acquisition remains a massive issue in India, whether it takes the forms of concessions for mining or grandiose projects such as Amravati. This was a big city project that was supposed to come in Andhra Pradesh, capital city project, which was based on the expropriation of 30 to 40,000 hectares of really good land from farmers. But I think they've agreed that this is not a good project today, which is a good thing. Right? So finally, I think the digital India tends to be a moving feast. There is a lot that is happening in that space, and it is changing by the minute. So I would be the first to admit that it is impossible to capture all that is happening to the digital in India. And it's many avatars as data in every productive and leisure sector in India. It's very difficult to do that. So what I've captured is necessarily a partial picture, although a picture nevertheless. As a political economist, I have in all of my writings dealt with issues related to the public interest. The gaps that exist focus on ownership and control, institutions and policy, winners and losers, and attempted to answer the question, who benefits from the digital, right? That's the key kind of question that I keep continuing to ask that question, and I'm not any clearer in terms of who really benefits, right? Except the corporates, I guess. I've continued my writings on the digital, and I have a new book out at Oxford later this year on information infrastructures, where I've explored issues with the satellite industry, with oceanic cable, among other infrastructures. Well, I've got another manuscript that is kind of exploring, which is basically a comparative study of platform regulation in the USA, EU, Australia, and India. And that's under a review at the moment. So I think I'll leave it at that. These are the kind of broad parameters of the book and issues that I've dealt with. And I now welcome Taberez and to respond to it. So thank you.
Thank you, Pradip. Thank you for introducing this book. Now I would like to invite Dr. Taberez to give his comments. Taberez, please.
Thank you very much for such a excellent summarization of your work, and also being so humble. And this is, as pointed out before by um, Wayu about yesterday talk. So this really goes very well where we ended up yesterday. And also one of the things that was very striking yesterday, uh, which is, as Mark pointed out, that when you write a book, so this is not the end product, so this is a beginning of a journey, because you cannot really, this is, and you deal with a very larger issues, so there needs to be much more debates and discussions. And this really continues even today. And you have also very humbly pointed out how this is an ongoing project and we need more and more research. So, thanks again for this. This is really an excellent work. It's theoretically incisive and empirically grounded, while digitalization makes the collection, storage, and analysis of data substantially quicker and easier. It also comes with certain limitation. And this duality has been well highlighted through your case studies of biometric digital identity project, with what is known as Aadhaar, as you pointed out, the working of patents, and the central monitoring system. So you have very well highlighted the relationship between state, capital, and the right-wing Hindutva forces, what you are calling fascist forces, but I would not go to that extent, but and how they have become major players in Digital India project. This is what you call the intermeshing of local politics with global geopolitics. So particularly, I like the way you foregrounded the debate on surveillance in India in the historical context. So you build this debate on important work of Christopher Baylis, and then go on to analyze the colonial state architecture of governance, which was largely a surveillance project. For example, the Telegraph Act of 1885 and the Indian Post Office Act 1898. So both of these acts allowed colonial government to intercept messages and articles that were posted. So, so importantly, the state justified these acts in turn surveillance on the pretext of public emergency. And we see there is some continuations today. And your historicization of the surveillance also reminds me of Stephen Mao's work, The Matrix Society. So this also shows some of the important questions that you raise in this book also have global relevance. So for example, Stephen Mao's is trying to look at the evolution of datafied society in three ways. So he's talking about the first wave, which was the rise of modern statehood and markets. So how the state tried to enumerate citizens, and then they started creating maps. So and all these were for governing purposes. So then there was industrial revolution, and then there was modern survey and mass data collection that started in the 19th century. So that's how he was trying to foreground the war, these entire debates in the first wave. And then comes the second wave, which is basically collecting data for social engineering, so because he wanted to deliver more targeted services to the citizens, even UN, United Nations Development Goals, so these were just to identify the dispossessed people so that you can really provide them welfare. And this was also one of the important objective of India's biometric Aadhaar project, which you have also highlighted. And that's where I pointed out there was the duality, so it's not just one way idea of surveillance, but then there was also this idea of welfare, which you have highlighted in the book. And then comes the third wave, and then the third wave is where there is a rise of platform capitalism and what you call as digital capitalism. So I think this also shows that there is some kinds of the issues that you are dealing with also have some global resonance, and India is not really detached from what has been happening in other parts of the world. So that's where I think the very idea of the how local politics are really connected with global geopolitics is really very well taken here. So that's the second important thing is that you have rightly pointed out the issue of the absence of privacy laws and how it really affects surveillance. So you argued that the expansion of surveillance goes parallel with curtailment of personal freedom, particularly for the dispossessed, because surveillance often targets dispossessed and vulnerable groups more because of land grab, which is possessed by India's indigenous communities. And that's where you pointed out like why the land grab becomes very important issues for capital expansion in India, and then the exploitations of the dispossessed communities. But can we see the relationship between surveillance and freedom beyond binaries? In other words, does one has to come at the cost of other? This is because in the current context, most of us dispossessed and middle classes are target of surveillance. Of course, dispossessed communities are more likely to suffer more, but they don't lack agency, and it has been also pointed out in several other studies. So I think this where I would like to know what's your take on this. And the third important thing that comes out in your book is also about how algorithm has become key in the extractive power of capital. So you stop going into this debate of platform capitalism, but then you devote a lot of time discussing about algorithm and how algorithm has become key to digital capitalism. And this becomes more serious issues when you use algorithm to manipulate behaviors for the ends of both the state and the corporate sector. So it's so that's where what is important here is, can there be some kind of accountability? So so that's where I think if you can push this debate, if I can ask you to take this debate a little bit further, can we really go into the arena to see how we can really create accountability, which you are talking about in the chapter on internet governance. So that is also very important issues in this entire debate on digital on debates on digital politics of digital India. So another important thing is that I really like the idea that you rightly pointed out that the state is not a homogeneous entity, and there. But I'm also wondering if you would also like to accept that capital is also not homogeneous, and whether they can be productive. And when I was looking at the entire debates on surveillance, so I was trying to find whether basically the work of David Lyon, and then you have definitely cited him. But I was wondering, like, why didn't you engage with David Lyon? So because he's so because he's trying to argue that its surveillance is now become, you cannot really escape from surveillance. It becomes part of the governmentality. So what is important in the current context is how to really make it more accountable, and that's where I think his work is very important, because he does not look at surveillance in a binary term. No, it's all bad, all it's going to look at take away your freedom and liberty. It does, but then it also comes with some other benefits. And so I have 2, 3. So just I have one more points I would raise here, because there are a lot of participants I can see here, and they would also like to ask you some questions. So one important thing that what I found is missing in your analysis is regional variation. So because I've been following your work since very long, you have all your Gyandut and Ichopal, all this work where you have very much well-grounded in the case study of Kerala and other things. So I was just wondering why that is missing from this book. So I will stop here.
Right. Thank you, Taberez. Let me try and respond to some of your questions. Yeah, I think, when one deals with surveillance, like any of the other big issues in India, we have to look at it in terms of context, right? And we have to look at it historically. Right? So surveillance is not something that is new in India. As you pointed out, it's been with us from kind of, pre-colonial times, right? It was there during the old days, it was there during the British, and it's there now, right? I think what has been an issue over the last couple of years is that, the kind of ramping up of surveillance at the expense of people's rights, right? And that is, of course, a global phenomenon, especially post 9/11 type of phenomenon, right? Where everywhere there was a ramping up of surveillance, right? And you had these major companies actually freely giving data on users to governments, right? And of course, this was something that was really brought out in those early, in the Snowden revelations, for example, right? Those kinds of things, right? So I think for me, the way I see it, I don't see this as a binary in any ways. There are, different levels of surveillance. I'm not saying that surveillance per se is a bad thing. There could be good reasons for governments to use surveillance to, for example, in their fight against terrorism, all that kind of stuff. So there's no question. I mean, those are important things that the state does, right? But I think that reason is often used as the basis for expanding surveillance, right? And the consequences of that can be really problematic for certain minority communities, right? And that's one of the big issues with respect to surveillance, right? That's the huge issue, right? So I'm not suggesting that surveillance is unimportant. Of course, it's important, right? In a big country like us, there has to be surveillance, right? But the ramping up of the surveillance, the amount of, the millions of rupees or dollars invested in these surveillance institutions in India, public sector institutions in India, the kinds of, the peoples that are being arrested because of this kind of surveillance, whole regions that are down because of surveillance, right? Like the Kashmir Valley or, parts of the Northeast, etc. These, I think, are inherently problematic because they go against people's rights, right? So I think, so I think we can't look at surveillance in binary terms, in black and white, right? There are different traditions and levels of surveillance, some that are important, but I think in the context of a hyper-nationalist state, they've kind of invested in another kind of understanding of surveillance, right? And in that, and so it would seem that every citizen is a kind of threat against the state, which is really problematic. They don't need to go down that route, right? And so I think there has to be some kind of a reckoning with surveillance. Now, where does that reckoning come from, right? And I think here I go back to my tradition of writing, of dealing with contestations and resistance, right? In a country like India, there is ample examples of resistance, right? At a variety of levels. There are so many different communication rights movements. I wrote about five movements, communication rights movements a couple of years ago, right, in a book. So there are, at any given level, there are some, fascinating work that's being done in the digital as resistance in the country. But I think the issue here is, this tendency of the government to try and include everybody in India in terms of its digital footprint and imprint is, I think, very problematic, right? Just last week or 10 days ago, I was involved in a panel discussing a really great edited volume from Sarai Institute called The Lives of Data, right? Where there were some fabulous chapters there, especially chapters on Aadhaar, where people are talking about how in rural India, it's so difficult for many people to actually enroll themselves, in this Aadhaar thing because of the fact that the thumb imprint of a farmer keeps changing all the time, right? It's very difficult to get an authentication organized, and the kinds of trials and traumas that people are going through because of this, right? So even within something like this, there are lots of people who are outside of it, right? And I can, as a good example, I can also tell you, that when I was in Chennai a couple of years ago, I, got the Aadhaar card, and the Aadhaar card was done at home, right? And it was done, and it was amazing to see how this whole thing was done because, no questions were asked. The Aadhaar card was given. So the issue of, the kinds of, the dilution of surveillance, the fact that, these things are not perfect, right? The fact that, these could be copied, right? Identities could be copied, and so on and so forth, raises lots of questions with respect to these grand narratives. Now, there's a good reason why, for example, countries like England decided not to go down this route, because they felt that these biometric technologies were inherently problematic, right? And that is why they decided not to go down the route. So why did our country, why did India go down this particular route is a question. But in terms of in terms of accountability, I think that accountability comes from strong civil society groups, right? Fighting for another understanding of the digital in India, right? And I think that is happening. I mean, I'm sure it's happening at a variety of level, at a variety of regional areas. I mean, it can happen through the kind of wonderful think tanks that we have. At the same time, it can happen through the wonderful grassroots projects that we have, right? So there is always in India a bubbling of those kinds of tendencies. So and I go back to something like the farmers' strike today, like one of the largest movements in the world, right? I mean, it's amazing that in a country that is, with a bit of a controlled state, that you can have something like this, right? And that, I think, is the strength of India. The fact that people only take, they take things to a certain extent, and after that they push against the state, they contest, right? And that's an important part of the story of India. Yeah, I think, why didn't I deal with David Lyon in a more kind of constructive way? I've used David Lyon in other writings of mine, because he's dealt with this kind of informational stratification, right? What information can do in societies, right? And the stratifications that have emerged in different parts of the world. But I find people like David Harvey, what should I say, as a political economist, right? My heart is, with people like him, because they deal with those contestations, right? They deal with the fact, you have got to decenter, the digital to understand the digital, right? That is something that I've done all my life. And I think people like David Harvey, they help you look at the kind of, the larger issues that are there in a country like India. How do you deal with poverty? How do you deal with all those kinds of issues? How do you deal with the marginalization of communities? Those are fundamental to understanding the imprint of the digital, right? Regional variations, yeah, again, yeah, I know, I agree. Taberez, in this particular book, I don't deal with too many of those regional variations, partly because, the question for me always is, where does one draw the line, right? This looked at some of the kind of macro issues that were there that, that I dealt with. I didn't deal with any of the kind of micro things in any earnest way. The chapter on seed basically looks at, mainly in Gujarat, right? Where, there's been the copying of seed that is used in a big way. I also, I think, allude to public sector software and the free and open source software movement in Kerala in this particular book, but I've dealt with it in much more kind of extensive fashion in other writings of mine, right? So I think I agree, Taberez, it has its limitations. I try and deal with the big picture, but as always, it has a number of limitations. And thank you for responding to my book. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradip. You managed to answer every single question Taberez has thrown at you. Yeah, thank you, Pradip. Right, I think now we're ready to open the floor. I guess many of the audiences and participants here are eager to ask Pradip questions. So how we are going to go about this, I hope you can first maybe turn on your video and you signal to me, by maybe waving your hands or raising your hands, so I know that you have something to say. Then I will just call your name and invite you to unmute yourself and answer questions, right? For those who are not comfortable about speaking out, maybe you can type in your questions and comments, just as our colleague Rosemary has done, right, in the chat box. So I'll try to read out those questions as well. So who wants to go first? You can just signal to me. Anyone? Yes, Ramesh. Ramesh, can we unmute? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah. Hi, Pradip. Ramesh here.
Yes. Hi.
Hi. No, I think it's interesting that you talked about the right sort of leftward shift of the Sangh Parivar, which is, quite evident in many of the, especially in the electoral game. But there is a culturally rightward shift, a very powerful rightward shift, which is a tendency of this government to sort of homogenize. They want to make one language, one religion, one ration card, one voting card, one election, in fact. So it's kind of weird that there are two kind of movements, one leftward, I think, for electoral gains, and one rightward to deliver on the RSS vision. It's kind of the opposite of what happened with China. China went rightward in generating capital and wealth, and has gone extremely leftward in their original ideology. So do you think this is going to pay off long term? And how does information fit into this kind of sort of schizophrenic kind of split?
I think, Ramesh, this is when you talk of this kind of a split, this is real politics, right? This is how they play their politics, right? The reality in India is that, if you look at what happened in West Bengal, the fact that a lot of BJP supporters in West Bengal were, at one time or the other associated with the left is fascinating in itself, right? That was their base, right? And that's fascinating, right? The question really is, yes, and I completely agree that there's also, in terms of culture, a rightward shift, right? They're trying to homogenize culture. Right? I think, but there are issues here. Achilles' heel is caste, I think, in India. Caste continues to be the Achilles heel in India. If they can figure that out, which they're trying, they do, occasionally try and figure it out. But I think, at the end of the day, this is a Brahminic, the BJP is a very Brahminic kind of, these are Brahmins behind it, right? So they're not going to relent and give up on their authority and all the rest of it, right? So that is, I think, the Achilles heel. And yet at the same time, this is what is happening. It's also a kind of a centralization of Hinduism that is happening today, right? It's a North Indian version of Hinduism. Right?
That's good.
And that goes against the South Indian versions in many ways. So there is bound to be some kind of contestation at some time or the other, right? For example, and I was reading the other day that, Ram being the key god in India, right? It itself is fascinating, because I think for most Indians, Shiva is the chief god, right? In the Pew, there was a recent survey of religion in India by the Pew Center, in which they've shown where Ram is on that list, right? Ram actually is on the 8th or 9th on that list. He's not in the first few, right? So, what do you make of that? Yes, there is I think, you're right. There is a movement towards a cultural movement towards the right. And they're trying their best to do that, but they will, I'm hoping that they won't succeed.
Obviously.
But because it's going to affect all sorts of communities, especially within the Hindu frame, right? Let alone the other minorities. Right? That's a different. But I think this, strategically, you can see they are playing at a game, right? And it's an interesting game because they can play this game because of the fact that there aren't enough, counter forces. There's not a strong opposition. The left is in disarray. All those kinds of things, right? That's a reality. And so in that context, they can play this game really well. They can deal with, but of course, in my home state, of course, in Kerala, probably the only state where it doesn't work, right? But even there are fundamentally important things towards the right. So, but
there's a lot of, Kerala, they are definitely seeding the right. And that's a long game for them, 5, 10, 15-year plan, as they're doing in Bengal. Bengal, as you said, the left has moved entirely to the right. So yeah, thanks a lot, Pradip. I don't want to hog up more of your time. Nice seeing you and all the best. Got your book right here. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ramesh. Any
You're welcome.
other one wants to ask a question? Can just signal to me. Or you
Okay,
can just
I'm going
unmute
to
yourself.
ask a
Yes,
question.
please, Jack, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Pradip. That was brilliant, and I really enjoyed your sharing as well as Taberez comments. Okay, some of the questions Taberez raised was also in my mind, but I want to ask a simpler question, okay, which I'm still trying to find an answer to, is how come the BJP and Modi, okay, could do it, okay, with limited, okay, success, of course, as you have outlined, but how come the Congress Party, okay, in the past, okay, I remember I started to follow Indian digital, okay, developments, you know, from the late 1990s and into the 2000s. And every time the Congress Party tried to change something, okay, they were facing all kinds of legal, like constitutional courts, okay, all kinds of political pushbacks that slow down the process. So, in this book, you mentioned Congress Party a couple of times, all right, and most of the attention, understandably, is on Modi and the BJP. But I remember when Modi started, okay, at least the international media that I follow, usually was actually that more of them were bad mouthing, okay, Modi, to say even within BJP he wouldn't have enough support, okay, and so I really appreciate your insights about the Hindu nationalism, okay, or the left wing we just discussed, the leftish, okay, development. But how come the Modi could do it, okay, relatively speaking, more successfully and facing much less pushbacks compared to the Congress Party? Is there some, yeah?
Yeah, I think,
Please.
I think I'm sure there are folks on this, who are watching this will probably have, better explanations for this. But the reality is that when Modi came to power, he came on a wave of anti-Congress power, right? Because the Congress had kind of, there were lots of scams, and there was this huge telecom scam that was, massive telecom scams, all sorts of things happened. And so when he came to power, he came on a, there was a massive wave against Congress, right? So he's unlike the Congress, he's in a situation where there is not any opposition, or the opposition is very fractured, and resistance is therefore very fractured, right? Which is why he can get away with some of these large, with these, large projects that he's involved in, right? But also, I think, the BJP is not, is in power because of the fact that they're backed by very strong organizations, Hindu right-wing organizations, right? And we sometimes forget that, so that gives them enormous strengths that reach every part of India, right? And that, so I think, so the Congress in the old days, I think there used to be resistance because the resistance used to come from the left, right? But the left has been decimated. Congress has been decimated. So and Congress is a pale shadow of what it used to be, right? So you have a situation where you have the BJP is like the Congress of the old days, Mrs. Gandhi's days, when they were really a powerful entity and there was nothing else to kind of, no political organization close to them, right? And I think the BJP is in that situation at the moment. So, which is why I think, there is, even if there is resistance, it's easily dealt with. They have got the powers to deal with legislation and laws. You basically lock up dissent. Anyone who dissents, you lock them up, right? Once you do that, then you don't have a problem, right? So that's happening in a big way in India. So a lot of people have been put into prison because of that dissent. And it reminds me of Mrs. Gandhi's emergency, 1975-77. There were 2 years or 3 years when Mrs. Gandhi became very authoritarian, right? And she locked up everybody. She locked up the journalists. She locked up all sorts of characters, right? It's similar today, although in the context of what's a veneer of democracy, right? Which is there in India. So I think the issue really here is with the fact that there is no strong, what should I say, counter oppositional party, which is why they've got away with all these different, legislation. Because having said that, the Congress is also responsible for many regressive policies, right? With respect to the digital. I mean, it was under the Congress regime that this biometrics identification scheme was launched, right? So these are not only the BJP's problem, these are all, part of the Congress as well. So we can't, again, it's very important that we don't see Congress as a shining light, because they were never a shining light. They were hugely problematic themselves. So the issue really is, what's the, it's between the devil and the deep blue sea. Which one do you want, right? We've had a couple of years of the BJP. Do we now want to go back to the Congress, or is it important that we have a coalition of forces, right? But coalitions have always been unstable in India, right? And a lot of people wouldn't want to go down that route. So it's like one of those issues. Thank you, Jack. Yeah.
Thanks, Pradip.
Thanks, Pradip. I'm going to read a question from the comments area. Apologies for my pronunciation, but from Ahmed Supadi, right? I think this question suggests that, your work, it goes beyond, the influence of work goes beyond India, because I think Ahmed is asking based on his or her Indonesian experience. So the question really is about counterpublics, right?
Yeah.
So do you see counterpublics maybe in India's public sphere? Here, Ahmed means counterpublics as a certain group of people who mostly don't participate in public discussions, but at critical moments they'll just appear and join the discussion. And judging from the way the question is asked, I guess Ahmed thought that some of the counterpublics might be right-wing or have the tendency to subscribe to intolerant views, right? So the question is, do you see this kind of internal politics played out in the digital India, and any implications for other countries like Indonesia, right?
So, I mean, of course, there are definitely counterpublics. One of the questions is, how do you kind of define what a counterpublic is, right? And who they are, right? And the way I see it is that the counterpublics are people who contest, who resist, who are not only part of the mainstream, but also those who are outside of the mainstream. So if you look at when you look at digital India, one of the issues with digital India, and I'm sure that's the same case in Indonesia and the Philippines, et cetera, is that you have a huge number of people who are outside of that framework of the official digital framework of a country, right? You have a huge number of people in the kind of informal informational economies, right? And you can argue that they are counterpublics. They can play the role of a counterpublic in many ways, because at that level you have lots of things happening, whether it's them being anti-IP, copyright free or copy left, all those kinds of issues you see happening in the context of the informal economies, right? The fact that you can get those, they've got wonderful right to repair movements, within that particular economy, So if you, for example, can't afford, of course, most people can't afford to buy an Apple phone. They can buy one of these Chinese-made phones, right? And there's an entire economy around that, right? People who know how to repair it, how to share data, all that kind of stuff. That's a counterpublic for me, right? So yes, definitely in the context of India, there are those different types of counterpublics that work both within the official sphere, public sphere, and outside of it, in these kinds of the informal public spheres that are there, right? You have those counterpublics playing a key role. And like I said, the counterpublic needs to look, also includes, major public intellectuals, policy think tanks that are there. And I can think of, many of those think tanks that are there, digital think tanks, et cetera, who are playing, I think, quite a progressive role in pushing for another understanding of digital India, right? But it's a long struggle. It's not an easy struggle because of the fact that you're dealing with a hegemonic state, a state that has got extraordinary power. Like we've never experienced this for, since Mrs. Gandhi's days in the late 60s and early 70s. We've never had this kind of hegemonic state, right? And that's one of the issues that we're dealing with.
Thanks, Pradip. I think here we have another question in the comment box. Again, it's now the reference point changes to China. Okay, so it asks whether during the COVID pandemic, you also see so-called collaborations between the state and big corporates, probably in India, to trace contact and surveil public health, right? So you spoke about the surveillance state, right? And how, it became too much, right? To threaten personal freedom, right? So what's that surveillance, right? On the front of public health data collection during the pandemic in India, what do you see? Do you see any abuses or weaponization of surveillance tools that would actually, influence the minority groups in a negative way, right? So what's your observation and take on that?
Again, there are probably people on the panel here and people who are participants who have a better kind of understanding of surveillance, and especially in the context of the public health crisis in India. But so here's an answer, response that is not based on much knowledge, but I'll try and give you an answer. I think unlike China, where you had a very strong state that could take care of the surveillance of its populations in different ways. I mean, it was pretty, the response from the Chinese government was pretty strong, right? They may have used this surveillance to kind of to target certain minorities, right? They may have done that. And I've read about some types of surveillance, but I'm not too sure if it was done in the specific context of this pandemic, right? I know that there's been surveillance of certain minorities in China, but that's been going on for a while, right? So I'm not too sure, how whether it was done in the specific context of those minorities. The issue in India with respect to the pandemic was that, especially the second wave of the pandemic, was that they were not ready for it, right? And what's happened in the country is that public health data collection varies from state to state, right? So that is a huge issue in the country. So we don't really have good, accurate information on overall deaths, right? The country is very proud to say that they're below Brazil and the USA in terms of deaths because it's hovering around that 400,000 kind of figure. When actually, there are people who suggest that close to 2.5 million people have died, right? And many in the northern states, especially in UP and some of those states where data gathering is very poor, right? And especially when you go into rural areas, data gathering is, extremely poor. So there are differences between how this whole thing has been kind of, communicated. And again, it's an issue with a subservient news media, right? We have a news media that is very subservient. There are very few of them who are willing to kind of contest the government's version of things. And that is a huge problem in itself, right? So I think the issue here is, during the pandemic, they got it really wrong, right? Thankfully, of course, Modi, unlike Bolsonaro and Trump, was not, he's not anti-vaccine and stuff like that, right? Thankfully, that was there. But despite all that, I think his, especially governments where, BJP governments in certain parts of India, there was a huge, they let down their guard. And as a result of that, I think there were huge issues with respect to, the pandemic itself, right? So they couldn't control it. After a while, the pandemic took its own, it kind of continued in crazy waves in different parts of the country, right? So I don't really think that minorities were targeted during the pandemic because it affected everybody, right? It affected everybody, right? And I think, in states like UP that has got a massive population that support the BJP, there was a lot of criticism because their own people died, right? It is not just the, so-called minority Muslims who died, but a lot of Hindus died. So this particular virus does not discriminate, right? It affects everybody, right? And so that's happened in India in a big way. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks,
I can see Cherian with his hands up there.
Yep. Sharing, do you want
Thanks,
to ask
Pradip.
your question?
Thank you. Hi, Pradip. So this is the time of year when I think we would normally be meeting at the IAMCR conference or whatever. So, so thanks to Wei Yu and Jack for letting us have this reunion virtually at least. My question has to do with the external dimension. How much, the two parts to it, I guess. One is, what's the role of the diaspora beyond the obvious? They're obviously a key part of the cyber warrior troops, I suppose. But secondly, is there any kind of considered grand global plan in the way that China has, right? So China has been trying to rewrite the rules of the global order, as it were, including in areas like freedom of expression. Is the BJP government content to kind of remain below the radar and out of criticism's way, or does it have some kind of ambition to nudge the global order, including internet governance, freedom of expression, towards its more total vision locally?
Oh, yeah, I think, the role of the, let me take the role of the diaspora first. Diaspora has been extraordinarily important to the successes of the BJP, right? They're part of the VHP, all these, especially from the USA. The US has got the bulk of them, right, who support the policies of the BJP. Now, how do they function? I think they function through their front organizations, right? Many of whom are aligned to the BJP, right? Front organizations which allow for a channeling of huge amounts of money. So it's very interesting to see how, for example, the government has come down on NGOs and all these other, over the last couple of years, last 10 years, it started during Congress times, but they've really come down hard on the non-governmental movement in India, right? Anyone that expresses dissent, they're shutting them down. Greenpeace was in problems. Amnesty International was in problems, et cetera, right? And yet some of these front organizations from the US and others, they don't have any problem, based in India, they don't have any problems. They can bring in any amount of money. So it's pretty clear, where the politics lies, right? So, I think at that level, there's been a lot of investment in these NRIs, and all these. You have now lots of spokespersons from the US, all these right-wing spokespersons who are part of this, of the BJP government, right? Who they listen to, kind of thing, right? So I can't say much more than that in terms of the diaspora. But in terms of the global plan, and this is very interesting, Cherian, that you brought up this whole issue of soft diplomacy, for example, right? I mean, if you look at India and China, where is India and where is China? Yes, of course, soft diplomacy to a certain extent is yoga for India, right? The fact that yoga, there's a World Yoga Day, etc., is a big deal for the BJP and all these characters, right? But beyond that, if you look at, for example, its own neighbors, right? Is that they don't have any kind of they don't have an initiative like the Silk Road initiative that the Chinese have got, right? They don't have their, say, for example, Confucius centers in different parts of the world, right? They don't have, in the US, yes, you do have the odd chair in Vedic studies and things like that, right? But beyond that, even in their own neighborhood, they've done a pretty bad job, right? Even Nepal, which was their closest ally, was against India, right? Is against India because they've been playing around with Nepal. Bangladesh, again, a very close ally of India, they've been playing around with Bangladesh, right? At the moment, right now, there are moves to kind of strengthen those relationships, right? But it's half-hearted. It's very half-hearted. Look at Sri Lanka, for example. Sri Lanka, there's a Chinese base in Sri Lanka, right? There's a port there that belongs to China, right? So India is in some ways surrounded by interests that are anti-Indian, right? And I think one of the reasons for this is, their hardline policies with respect to minorities, etc., has not played in well in the context of these other countries, right? It has been very problematic. They should never have wrong-sided Bangladesh. After all, India was involved in the liberation of Bangladesh, right? And, the least they could have done is got them onto their side. No. But, they were part of the problems in Assam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of their soft diplomacy, I mean, look at, for example, what China has done in terms of investments in CC, in the television, right? International television. You know, they have big time, right? That they put money into it. India has not put any of that kind of money, right? So in terms of soft diplomacy, they've failed miserably, I think, right? Of course, you know, in the context of these Hindutva guys, there are people who love to think of a grand India. And the grand India, of course, stretches, of course, includes Pakistan and Afghanistan and all the rest of it, right? But that's in their dreams, right? You know, they're never going to achieve that, you know? So I think, well, the Chinese are a lot more kind of, you know, mainland China, the Communist Party is a lot more kind of, I think, strategic in terms of how they've approached this. The Indians have not, you know, so it's intermittently you see certain policies, but nothing consistent, right? With like the Silk Road Initiative kind of thing, right? At that level, right? You know, I was amazed when I was in China, in Beijing at the university, at that, you know, communications university a couple of years ago, many years ago now, a whole group of African students there, right? An entire group of Africans doing the masters in communications. I was amazed. Right? I said, what the hell are you guys doing here, kind of stuff? And they said, look, in all our countries, China has invested, right? And we know exactly why we're here, kind of thing. But India hasn't done the same kind of thing, right? So they've not. So in terms of that diplomacy, there's a long way to go, Charil. It's on a different level.
That's a relief, I guess, right?
That's a relief. Yes.
All right, that's a great discussion, you know, on the external forces or the geopolitics. So I think there are two more questions in the comment box, but you know, I can't say that I fully understand the questions, but I'll try my best, right? So one question from Benedict Nania is that the economic success of our neighbor, that's again China, has got a lot to do with India's post-nationalist population or post-nationalist populism. I'm not sure what the word is here. So, you know, I guess the question I'm really trying my best to guess is about, you know, the trade-offs between, you know, it's a gain of one country, China, might be the loss of another country, India, or the loss of the one country, India, becomes a gain of another country, China. So it's very much geopolitics, right? I'm not sure whether Pradip has any comments on that.
No, I don't. I think it's geopolitics, right? And I think at this particular moment in time, it's the Chinese who are winning this game, not the Indians. So it's as simple as that.
Okay, all right. A very straightforward and simple answer. Thank you, Pradip. All right, then probably I move on. You know, I see a hand here in the audience. Adrian, yes, Adrian, please.
I feel like I should hold back a little bit because I got the chance to edit the book, so I read it 2 years before everybody else. So I don't.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that I was thinking of here, going back to the kind of discussion around, you know, the ambivalent state here, when we're kind of talking about digital India, not just about the kind of changing political scenario. And I do agree. It seems to me it's also very much like 1975 right now in India. It certainly felt that way last time I was there. But is it inherently these kind of big, huge digital projects, you know, require that there's such mass and scale, and there's a link to the kind of, you know, the politics of developmentalism, competitive futurism as the big game that's being played in Asia. That means governments inevitably can only partner with a small number of players. And then that leads to kind of crony capitalism, more or less, in the era of national champions. And we can see how the government of India is interacting with, you know, with the Ambanis and others. And the trade-off for facilitating, you know, driving a train through the constitution in order to facilitate the growth of these big digital empires, is that they will provide the infrastructure spending and the backbone that will enable the state to realize its welfare vision as well. So it's a kind of Faustian bargain. And of course, these are the only people big enough to negotiate with the Americans, with Microsoft and the others who will bring in the technology as well. So, you know, if we think about that in a comparative sense, as we're sort of talking now, you can see other sort of Faustian bargains that have been made across Asia between these big corporates and governments that have to kind of balance, to make those double movements between kind of popular indigeneity and kind of anti-corporatism, but also kind of facilitating the growth of these, very, very powerful companies that are going to have a large grip across the whole economy, the whole kind of mediated digital economy. So where do you see that? I mean, you talk a bit about how within the RSS there's tension about this already, but do you see this potentially becoming derailed as it's come into kind of question in China over the last year about how far you can allow these things to grow? And
well, again, difficult question. I think as we speak, as we have this conversation, I think the imprint of the digital is becoming more and more expansive and extensive in India. Right? So there's no question about that. I think the issue really is, where will the contestation come from? Something like this, right? Is there a kind of countervailing force? Right? What is that countervailing force? Who can do this? And for me, I think I'm a firm believer in the grassroots and civil society and stuff like that. I think the countervailing force is always from there, right? It's not from you can't expect the Congress to do something exciting because they're part of the same issue, right? They have the same interest in many ways. We've had a history of dealing with the left in India, and left can vary from the guys in West Bengal to the ones in Kerala. And Kerala, I think, has at least over the last 20 years, 30 years, done very interesting things with the digital, right? For example, the public sector software movement, right, based on free and open source principles, etc. That was very strong in Kerala, right? The fact that they, for example, pushed for free and open source software in all their, in their public schools, for example, in Kerala, right? It was all based on FOSS. And what they also did was they also trained teachers in every school to deal with the glitches, right? So they were not dependent on the big proprietary software companies, But this has only happened in bits and pieces in Kerala, maybe one or two other states. Karnataka also has had some very interesting digital initiatives that are, basically public oriented kind of stuff. But where do you find that in the rest of India, right? You don't see too much of that. Kerala, of course, is an oddity in some ways, right? They bucked the trend in some ways. They're still holding on to a certain form of communism, which is crazy in India today. But it seems to have worked, right? It seems to have worked there. And that's very, where else do you see that kind of countervailing force in India? So yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Adrian. I think, we are living in that environment in which these big government projects, these governmentality projects don't have any resistance, in that big kind of way. But there is a resistance, like I said earlier, at the level of certain intellectuals, certain policy making bodies, grassroots organizations, and also I think in the informal economy, right, where there's a different thing happening altogether, right? And people are in many ways actually, trying to create their own digital futures, right? In a very different, difficult context. And this is why, in the context of this media ownership, project that Adrian and I are working on, one of the issues that I've raised is about how do you account for the informal economy, the informal digital economy, right? Given the fact that millions of people actually rely on that, right? They're not part of the formal economy. Right? How do we factor them in? It's a tough job, but it has to be factored in, I think. I'll leave it at that, Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with that great question and great answer, we are close to the end of this book talk, right? Pradip, you talked about countervailing forces. We were discussing the future of the digital world in yesterday's talk as well. I think your answer really beautifully summarized one way to look for the future. It's basically to look at the future, maybe from the past or from the unnoticed present, right? You're talking about the informal digital economies, right? We probably can look at them as alternative futures the world can pursue, right? So thank you so much for this beautifully summarized answer. I'll probably have to say sorry to many great participants and their questions get unanswered, but a book talk is always the start of a conversation, right? So we really learned a lot from talking to Pradip, and I hope that all of you can continue the conversation with Pradip, maybe through emails and through other digital means, right? Again, it's our great honor to have you here, Pradip. But before we let you go, we let all the participants go, I would like to invite every one of us probably to turn on your camera for a brief moment, because we would really love to take a Scott group photo now. I see the Harum. Hey, long time no see, my old friend right there. Right?
Yes, Harum.
Yeah.
Yes, please turn on your camera, and it's
Right,
okay if you don't
please.
have the virtual background. Yes.
Yeah, it's fine if you don't have the virtual background. It doesn't matter. But if you can turn on your video and show your face, that would be wonderful, right?
Yeah, actually, yes. Yeah, it would be great, everyone, if you can sit up a little bit. Okay, like Feng Lao Shi. Yeah, so that I learned this, like if you can put one fist above your head and see the face. So that's the right way. That's the that's the. Okay.
All right. Shall we?
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well. Okay. I will keep a screenshot.
So 1, 2, 3. Oh, there's one more person coming. Yeah. All right. One more. Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Okay. Have done. Thanks.
Great.
All right.
Well,
thank you so much, Pradip.
Yeah. Just to say that, I dedicated this book, one of the guys is to Zarom. Because Zarom and I are all compatriots. We've done a lot. And Ramesh, the guy who spoke as well, we've had crazy times together.
Yeah, great
Thank
to
you,
know. Great
Pradip.
to see. Yeah.
Thank you, Taberez. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Bayu.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Pradip.
Probably I will
Thank you,
see you
everybody,
guys
for joining
later
us.
this week. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.